Months had passed since that unforgettable charity concert. The applause of that night still echoed in her heart, but her life had moved into a quiet, steady rhythm again. Every day brought new lessons, new faces, and new opportunities. The world that once seemed too far away now felt within reach. But even with all the good things happening, there was one place that still pulled her heart: the restaurant where everything had begun. It was a cool autumn evening when she finally decided to visit again. The street looked just the same as it always had. Warm lights glowing from inside, the soft clinking of glasses, the smell of roasted food and coffee filling the air. Through the glass, she could see the tables filled with people laughing and talking, just like old times. But there was one big difference. Her picture now hung near the entrance, framed neatly on the wall with a small sign underneath that said, "Once our waitress, now our star." She stood for a moment smiling at it. It felt strange, like looking at a younger version of herself, one who had no idea how much her life was about to change. When she stepped inside, the familiar faces greeted her with wide smiles. The cook waved from the kitchen, shouting over the sound of sizzling pans, "Look who's back!" The manager came forward, his eyes full of pride. "You came just in time," he said warmly. "We've been planning something special tonight." She laughed softly. "What's that?" He winked. "You'll see soon enough. But first, take a seat. You're our guest tonight." She felt a little shy sitting among the crowd instead of working. The waiters she once worked beside now served her with a kind of playful respect. She thanked each one with a smile, remembering the long nights they had shared when the restaurant was quieter, and dreams felt so far away. As she looked around, memories came rushing back, the sound of dishes clattering, the faint hum of the old piano in the corner, the nervous feeling she had on that one fateful night when she first dared to play in front of everyone. It had all begun here. A few minutes later, the lights dimmed slightly. The manager walked to the center of the room and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we have someone very special among us tonight. Many of you know her story. It started right here in this very restaurant. Tonight, we want to honor her journey and thank her for reminding us that dreams are never too small." He turned toward her, smiling. "And since she gave us the gift of music, we thought it's only fair we ask for one more song, for old time's sake." The guests began to clap softly, encouraging her. She laughed, a bit embarrassed, but her heart felt full. "I didn't come prepared," she said. The manager smiled. "The piano is waiting." "It always is." She hesitated for only a moment before standing up. The crowd parted as she made her way to the piano in the corner, the same old one that had once carried her first performance. Her hands brushed lightly over the keys, feeling their familiar texture. She took a deep breath, smiled at everyone watching, and began to play. The first notes flowed gently, almost like a whisper. The melody was simple, honest, and full of emotion. It wasn't about showing skill or perfection. It was about telling a story, her story. The people listened quietly, some closing their eyes, others watching her with admiration. As she played, memories filled her mind. Late nights cleaning tables, moments of doubt, the kindness of strangers who believed in her, the faces of her co-workers who had become like family. Every note carried gratitude, love, and a deep sense of peace. When the final note faded, the room remained silent for a moment, as if no one wanted to break the spell. Then came the applause, loud, heartfelt, and full of warmth. She stood up, smiling shyly. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't think I'll ever forget this place. It gave me more than a job. It gave me my beginning." The manager stepped forward again, holding a small envelope. "There's something we want to give you," he said. She shook her head. "You've already given me enough." But he placed it gently in her hands. "Just open it," he insisted. Inside, she found a handwritten note and a small silver key. The note read, "For the one who taught us that even ordinary places can hold extraordinary stories. This key belongs to you and to the piano that started it all. It will always be here waiting for you." Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at the key. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You already said it," the manager replied softly. "Every time you played." Later that night, when most of the guests had left, she stayed behind for a while. The restaurant was quiet again, the lights dimmed low. She sat alone at the piano, holding the key in her hand. She thought about how much her life had changed. Not because of luck, but because she had chosen to take a step when fear told her not to. She had learned that sometimes all it takes is one small moment of courage to open doors you never knew existed. She began to play again, just for herself. The melody was gentle and full of emotion, a goodbye and a beginning all at once. As the notes filled the empty room, she could almost feel the presence of her younger self sitting beside her. The girl who had once dreamed quietly while wiping tables, who had believed that music was something that belonged only to others. Now that same girl had found her place. The sound of footsteps broke her thoughts. The security guard, the same one who had always stayed late, smiled as he approached. "Still playing after everyone's gone," he said. "Some things never change." She laughed softly. "I guess not." He nodded toward the piano. "You and that thing and you were always meant to be together." She smiled. "Maybe you're right." He leaned against the doorframe. "You know, I was here that night when you first played. I remember thinking, something's different about this girl. She's not just playing notes. She's telling a story." And I was right. His words warmed her heart. "Thank you," she said, "for listening when no one else did." He waved it off with a grin. "I just knew you'd go far. But don't forget, this place will always be yours too." As he walked away, she sat in silence for a moment longer, then closed the piano gently. She stood up, took one last look around, and smiled. The air smelled the same, a mix of coffee, wood, and warmth. It was as if time had never really moved, only circled back to this place to remind her of where it all began. Before leaving, she placed the small silver key back on top of the piano. She whispered softly, "Keep it safe for me." Outside, the night air was cool and fresh. The city lights glowed softly, and the sounds of distant traffic filled the silence. She pulled her coat a little tighter and began to walk home. On her way, she passed by a group of street musicians playing a slow, tender tune. One of them recognized her and smiled. "You're the pianist from the restaurant, aren't you?" he asked. She nodded shyly. "I suppose I am," he grinned. "You've inspired a lot of us. Makes us believe it's possible." She paused for a moment, listening to their music, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. She handed it to him. "Keep playing," she said. "One day someone will stop and listen. That's all it takes." He unfolded it and saw a few lines of handwritten music, the same melody she had played that night in the restaurant. His eyes widened in surprise. "Thank you," he said. She smiled. "You'll know what to do with it." As she continued walking, she felt a calm happiness inside her. She didn't need grand stages or bright lights to feel fulfilled. The music had already done what it was meant to do. It had touched people, brought hope, and healed her own heart. When she reached home, she placed her piano key on the table and sat down by the window. The city outside shimmered softly under the moonlight. She closed her eyes, replaying the notes in her head. Her journey had begun with uncertainty, built on quiet dreams and endless nights of doubt. But it ended with peace, the kind that comes when you know you've found your place in the world. She smiled faintly, whispering to herself, "Maybe magic isn't in big moments. Maybe it's in the courage to start small." The room filled with silence, not the kind that feels full rather than empty. She rested her hand on the piano keys one last time that night, then began to play, softly and slowly. And as the music drifted through the window into the quiet streets below, it carried with it the story of a girl who once served tables in the corner of a restaurant, and who, with nothing more than a song and a little courage, turned an ordinary night into something truly unforgettable. The morning after the audition, she woke up earlier than usual. The first thing she did was check her phone, though she knew it was too soon for a reply. Her hands felt cold from nervousness. Every sound in her small apartment seemed louder than usual. The ticking of the clock, the humming of the fridge, even the soft wind brushing against the window. She tried to distract herself by making tea, but her thoughts kept drifting back to that room. The piano, the quiet faces of the judges, the way her hands had trembled at first, and how calm she'd felt by the time she finished. All day she waited. She went to work, smiled as she served customers, and played at night, pretending everything was normal. But deep inside, her heart carried a mix of hope and fear. 3 days later, the email finally arrived. Her breath caught when she saw the subject line, "Audition Results Conservatory Board." For a long moment, she just stared at the screen, afraid to open it. Then with shaky fingers, she tapped it open. It read, We are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted into our program. Your performance showed remarkable emotional depth and authenticity. We look forward to welcoming you." She covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. She read the message again just to make sure she hadn't imagined it. It felt unreal. Her dream, the one she'd buried long ago, had come back to life. She sat down at her piano and began to play softly, not for anyone else, but for herself. The tune was full of relief, gratitude, and disbelief. When she told her coworkers later that evening, they cheered and hugged her. The cook clapped loudly and said, "I told you! You were born for this." The manager smiled proudly. "You've brought something special to this place. But I knew you wouldn't be here forever." She laughed through her tears. "I'm not leaving yet," she said. "Just learning again. Maybe I'll still play here on weekends." He nodded warmly. "This will always be your stage." Word spread quickly. Guests who had watched her before congratulated her when they came to dine. Some even brought flowers. The same people who once barely noticed her now treated her like an artist. A week later, she walked through the tall glass doors of the conservatory for the first time as a student. The hallway smelled of polished wood and old sheet music. Young musicians hurried by, carrying violins and sheet folders, while soft notes from a distant piano floated through the air. She felt nervous, but also proud. It had taken her years to get here, not through luck, but through quiet persistence and love for the music she never gave up on. Her first day was both exciting and intimidating. She was older than most of the students. Some looked at her curiously when she introduced herself, but when she played, the room fell silent. Her music carried a kind of sincerity that technique alone couldn't create. It came from life itself, from struggle, from patience, from nights spent dreaming. Her teacher, a kind older woman with gentle eyes, said after class, "You play like someone who's lived every note." Those words stayed with her. They reminded her that her journey, though different, had given her something valuable, a truth that no classroom could teach. Outside of class, life at the restaurant continued. On weekends, she returned to play for the guests who still came just to hear her. The restaurant owner had even changed the sign outside. "Live Piano by Lena, Friday and Saturday evenings." People began calling ahead to reserve tables near the piano. Couples celebrated anniversaries there. Friends came to unwind after long weeks. Every night she played, she poured a little more of her heart into the music. One evening, after she finished a soft melody, a man approached her. He introduced himself as a journalist from a local newspaper. "Your story has reached many people," he said. "Would you be willing to share it?" At first, she hesitated. "I don't know," she said softly. "It feels strange to talk about myself." But the journalist smiled kindly. "You might inspire others who've lost hope. Sometimes people just need to see that it's never too late to follow their dream." She thought about that for a moment, then nodded. "All right," she said. "But I want it to be about the music, not about fame or attention." A few days later, the article was published with the headline, "From Waitress to Pianist, the story that touched a city." It wasn't dramatic or exaggerated. It simply told her journey, how she'd once played in secret, how fate had given her a chance, and how that one night had changed everything. The response was overwhelming. The restaurant received calls from people wanting to meet her. Some were aspiring musicians. Others were people who had given up their own dreams. One message read, "Thank you for reminding me that it's never too late to begin again." Those words touched her deeply. She realized her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever doubted themselves. Her days became busier. Between her studies, performances, and interviews, time flew. But no matter how much her life changed, she stayed humble and grounded. She still helped around the restaurant when needed. She still talked to the cleaners, the cooks, and the staff who had believed in her before anyone else did. One night, after a small recital at the conservatory, the composer who had first noticed her came backstage to see her. "You've come a long way," he said with a proud smile. "But this is just the beginning." She looked at him with gratitude. "You were the first person to believe I could do more." He shook his head gently. "You already had it in you. I just helped you see it." As the months passed, her music began to take her to new places. She was invited to perform at small events, then larger ones. Her confidence grew with each performance. Audiences didn't just hear her notes, they felt her emotions. But even with the growing attention, she stayed true to the same gentle rhythm of her life. She practiced daily, visited her family whenever she could, and never forgot where her journey had begun, behind the counter of a restaurant, serving coffee and silently dreaming of the piano in the corner. One evening, when she returned home after a long day, she sat by the window and looked out at the city lights. The same city that once seemed too big, too cold, now felt like home. She smiled softly and whispered, "Thank you." It wasn't just gratitude for success, it was for everything that had led her here. The struggles, the sleepless nights, the moments of doubt, and even the quiet tears. Without them, her music wouldn't have the same soul. A few weeks later, she was invited to perform at a charity concert, the same kind of event where her story had begun. This time, though, she wouldn't be serving the guests. She would be the one everyone came to hear. When she walked into the grand hall, the chandeliers sparkled just like before. For a second, her heart filled with memories. The nervousness, the trembling hands, the soft first note she had once played in that very place. Now, standing on the same stage, she smiled. The lights dimmed. The audience hushed. As she sat at the piano, she took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "Let it come from the heart." The first note rang out, gentle, confident, and full of life. Each sound carried her story. People in the audience leaned forward, captivated once again. When she finished, the hall erupted into applause. She looked up, tears shining in her eyes, and smiled humbly. That night after the concert, people came to congratulate her. But among all the handshakes and kind words, one moment stood out. An elderly woman who approached her quietly and said, "You reminded me of the beauty and simplicity. Thank you for that." She smiled warmly and replied, "Music finds everyone differently. I'm just glad it found you tonight." Later, as she left the hall and walked under the cool night sky, she felt lighter than ever. The stars looked brighter, and the air carried the faint echo of applause. Her journey was far from over, but she no longer needed validation. She had learned that true success wasn't about fame or perfection. It was about staying honest to who you are and never giving up on what makes your soul feel alive, and so she kept walking, not as a waitress dreaming of a piano, but as a musician who had finally found her place in the world, one melody at a time. The next morning, she woke up with the sunlight streaming softly through her window. For a few seconds, she lay still, wondering if everything from last night had been just a dream. But then she saw the small white card on her bedside table, the one the composer had given her, and her heart skipped. It was real. She sat up slowly, running her fingers over the edge of the card. His words echoed in her mind. "You belong there, not behind a serving tray." The thought both thrilled and frightened her. She had worked at the restaurant for years, blending into the rhythm of daily life, never asking for more. Now one night had changed everything. When she arrived at work that afternoon, the restaurant felt different. The same tables, the same music, the same smell of coffee and baked bread, but the looks on people's faces had changed. Her coworkers greeted her with smiles that carried curiosity and admiration. One of the waitresses whispered, "You were amazing last night. Everyone's talking about you," another added. "Even the owner said he didn't know we had a star working here." She blushed, trying to brush off their compliments. "I just got lucky," she said quietly. But luck wasn't the right word. Deep inside, she knew that what had happened came from years of quiet practice, from love for the music she never stopped playing even when no one listened. The manager called her into his office later that day. His usual serious expression had softened. "You made quite an impression last night," he said. "The guests can't stop talking about your performance. Some of them called this morning asking for your name." She smiled shyly. "That's very kind of them." He leaned forward. "You know, one of the guests said we should feature you again. Maybe not as background music, but as part of our weekend entertainment. People would come just to listen." Her eyes widened. "Me, play again?" "Why not?" he said, smiling. "You've got something special. And let's be honest, why it's good for business, too." She laughed softly, both surprised and grateful. "If you really think so, I'd be happy to." The idea of playing again filled her with excitement but also nervousness. Could she really handle performing regularly in front of people? Just thinking about it made her heart beat faster. That evening, when the restaurant quieted down, she sat at the piano again. This time, she didn't play just for herself. She played as if the whole world could hear. The soft sound filled the empty room, echoing through the glass walls. The security guard paused by the door, listening quietly like always. "You know," he said after a while, "I told you you'd be fine." "Guess I was right," she smiled. "Yes, you were." The days that followed felt like a dream she didn't want to wake up from. The story of the waitress who played piano at a fancy gala spread quickly. Someone had recorded her performance on their phone and shared it online. By the next morning, thousands of people had watched it. The video title read, "Waitress Stuns Elite Crowd with Heartfelt Piano Performance." At first, she didn't believe it. When a co-worker showed her the video, her hands trembled as she watched herself on the small screen. The camera had caught the emotion in her face, the way her fingers moved softly over the keys. And the comments, they were filled with kindness. "She plays with such soul." "This made me cry." Reminds me that real talent can come from anywhere. She sat quietly, reading each one with tears in her eyes. She had never imagined that strangers would feel something from her music. A few days later, the restaurant phone began ringing more often. People wanted to reserve tables for the nights she would play. The manager looked both proud and slightly overwhelmed. "Looks like you've become our secret weapon," he joked. But to her, it wasn't about fame or attention. It was about connection, the feeling that her music could reach hearts even of people she didn't know. Then one evening, just before her shift, the composer who had given her his card came to visit. He smiled warmly as she approached. "I told you you had something rare," he said. "Now the whole city knows it." She laughed softly, still unsure how to handle praise. "I didn't expect any of this. It feels like a dream," he nodded. "Dreams feel that way until you decide to live them." He handed her an envelope. "Inside are details about a small audition at the conservatory. No pressure, just come and play something for the board. I think you belong there." She stared at the envelope as if it were a treasure. Her throat tightened. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'll think about it." That night, when she played for the restaurant again, her heart was filled with mixed feelings. Excitement, fear, hope. The crowd listened closely, clapping warmly after every song. But behind her calm smile, her thoughts ran wild. Could she really step into a world she had once lost? Could she leave the safety of what she knew? After the last guest left, she stayed behind as usual, sitting alone by the piano. The restaurant lights dimmed to a soft golden glow. She placed the envelope on top of the piano and stared at it. She remembered her childhood, the small apartment where her mother would hum along while she practiced, the afternoons she spent dreaming of being on a stage. But then came the years when everything changed. Her father's illness, the bills, the long nights at work. Music had become a quiet shadow of her old self. Now it had come back into her life, asking her to choose again. She opened the envelope and looked at the date of the audition. It was only a week away. Her heart began to race. The next few days were a blur of emotion. She practiced whenever she could, after work or early in the morning before leaving home. Her fingers ached, but her soul felt alive again. The restaurant became both her stage and her classroom. The piano that had once been just a piece of furniture now felt like a friend guiding her towards something bigger. Her co-workers supported her, cheering her on in small ways. The cook would wink and say, "Play us something before you go." The cleaners would stop and listen for a few minutes, smiling quietly. But not everyone understood. One of the senior waiters said one evening, "Be careful. Dreams don't always pay bills. Sometimes it's better to stay where life is steady." She didn't argue. She knew he was only being practical. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the feeling that this chance had come for a reason. Finally, the day of the audition arrived. She took the morning off work and stood outside the conservatory, her heart pounding as she looked up at the tall glass doors. Inside, she could hear faint music from practice rooms, soft notes, quick scales, voices giving instructions. When her name was called, she stepped into the small hall where 3 people sat behind a desk waiting. She introduced herself quietly and sat at the piano. For a moment, her hands trembled, but then she remembered the restaurant, the faces of people who had listened and believed. She took a deep breath and began to play. The piece she chose wasn't a famous one. It was her own, a simple melody she had written years ago. Each note carried a piece of her journey, the quiet nights, the lost dreams, the rediscovery of her own courage. When she finished, the room was silent. One of the panelists smiled softly and said, "That was beautiful. Very honest. She nodded, unable to speak. Later that evening, when she returned to the restaurant, the staff was waiting for her. "How did it go?" they asked. "I think it went well," she said, smiling shyly. "They said they'd let me know soon." That night, she played for the guests again, and even though she was exhausted, her music sounded brighter than ever. She didn't know what the future would bring, but she knew that she was no longer afraid of it. As she finished her last song, a man at the corner table raised his glass and said, "To the girl with magic in her hands." Everyone clapped, and for a moment she felt the warmth of belonging, not just to that place, but to herself. When she walked home later, the stars looked brighter than usual. The city noise faded behind her as she whispered softly, "Maybe dreams do wait for us. We just have to be brave enough to walk back to them." She smiled, knowing that whatever came next, acceptance, rejection, or something entirely new, she had already found what she had been missing all along, her voice. The soft hum of conversations filled the room once more as the evening carried on. But something had changed. The music had touched everyone, even those who usually never cared about such things. There was a kind of quiet respect in the air now, a shared feeling that they had all witnessed something rare. She sat at the piano, still a little dazed from the applause. Her hands rested on her lap, her fingers slightly trembling. She could still feel the warmth of the keys on her skin. The moment had passed, yet it lingered in her chest like a living heartbeat. The manager gave her a small nod from across the room. It wasn't his usual commanding look. It was softer, almost proud. She returned the nod, barely smiling. That simple exchange meant more to her than words ever could. But she didn't have much time to think. A waiter hurried over and whispered, "They're asking if you'll play again." She blinked. "Who's asking?" He pointed discreetly toward a table near the center of the room. Sitting there were some of the most important guests of the night, a well-known film director, a gallery owner, and a composer whose music she had once listened to on an old radio. Her heart jumped. "They want me to play again?" The waiter smiled. "They said your music made the night feel alive." For a moment, she didn't know what to say. Then she nodded slowly, stood up, and returned to her seat at the piano. The chatter in the hall softened again as she lifted her hands over the keys. The lights from the chandelier shimmered above her, casting golden reflections across the piano's polished surface. She closed her eyes for a second and took a deep breath. This time she didn't think about who was watching. She didn't think about mistakes or expectations. She thought about the girl she used to be, the one who dreamed of performing but had to trade music for a job, responsibility, and long nights of quiet service. Her fingers began to move. The first few notes were gentle, like a whisper. Then slowly they grew stronger, each one falling into place with emotion that no words could express. The melody was not planned. It came from somewhere deep inside her, as if her heart was finally telling its story after years of silence. The sound filled the hall, floating between tables, wrapping around the guests in waves of warmth. The composer at the center table leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. The film director sat still, his glass untouched. Even the waiters slowed their steps, listening without realizing it. There was something different about this performance. Her music wasn't just beautiful, it was human. It carried the pain of long days, the quiet hope of forgotten dreams, and the peace of finally being heard. She played as if she had been waiting her whole life for this moment. The melody rose and fell like the rhythm of breathing. Every note felt alive, full of emotion that made people forget where they were. One guest near the back whispered, "It's like she's telling a story." And she was. But it wasn't just hers. It was a story of everyone who had ever dreamed, failed, and still kept something alive inside them. The final note lingered in the air, soft and trembling, before fading into silence. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, applause filled the room again. Louder this time, more heartfelt. Some people even stood up, clapping with tears in their eyes. The manager looked around in disbelief. He had never seen the restaurant like this. The atmosphere was not one of luxury or pride anymore. It was human, warm, connected. She stood from the piano, her cheeks flushed, unsure what to do. She gave a small bow, then quickly stepped aside, her heart racing. The composer stood from his seat and began to walk toward her. She froze, her hands clasped together. He smiled kindly and said, That was extraordinary. Where did you learn to play like that? She hesitated, her voice soft. I learned when I was little. My mother taught me a little, and I practiced whenever I could. He nodded slowly, studying her face. You have a gift. Not just talent, you play with truth. You don't see that often. Her eyes widened slightly. Thank you, sir. That means a lot. Do you write your own pieces? He asked. Yes, she said quietly. Mostly just small ones. I never shared them with anyone. He smiled again. You should. The world needs real music like that. Before she could reply, the film director joined them, clapping his hands together. You made the whole evening feel different, he said. That kind of emotion can't be taught. You either have it or you don't, and you definitely have it. She didn't know what to say. Compliments like these felt unreal, almost too heavy for her to hold. She just nodded and thanked them softly. As the night went on, guests continued to approach her, each one saying something kind or amazed. Some asked if she had ever performed before. Others asked if she had any recordings. She could only smile and shake her head. When the event finally ended, the restaurant began to quiet down again. The staff started cleaning up, their faces glowing with relief that the night had gone so well. But she stayed near the piano, unable to move. Her heart was still full, her mind spinning with everything that had happened. The manager walked up to her with a smile that was more genuine than she had ever seen. You did something special tonight, he said. I don't think any of us expected it, but you changed the whole atmosphere. Everyone's talking about you. She laughed nervously. I just played what I felt. And that, he said, is exactly why it worked. As the last guest left, the composer came back to her one more time. He handed her a small card. If you ever want to study music again, call me, he said. I teach at the conservatory. You belong there, not behind a serving tray. She stared at the card in disbelief, her fingers brushing over the printed letters. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it, he said gently. I will, she whispered. After he left, she sat down at the piano again. The room was empty now, just like it always was when her shift ended. But tonight felt different. The silence was not lonely anymore. It was peaceful. She placed her hands on the keys once more and played softly, just for herself. The music was calm, almost like a goodbye to the girl she used to be. When the final note faded, she sat still for a long time, listening to the echo of her own heart. Outside, the city lights shimmered across the streets. As she stepped out into the cool night air, a soft breeze brushed against her face. She walked slowly, the manager's words replaying in her head, the applause still ringing in her ears. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. People had seen her, not just as a waitress, but as someone with something to say. At a small crossing, she stopped and looked up at the stars barely visible between the tall buildings. She thought about her mother, about the piano that was sold long ago and how she had promised herself never to dream too much. But now, she realized, some dreams don't die. They just wait for the right moment to be heard. When she reached home, she quietly placed the composer's card on her bedside table. She lay down, unable to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the people listening to her, their eyes soft with emotion. She heard the applause again, and the sound filled her with warmth. The world that had once felt too big and far away suddenly seemed closer. Maybe she didn't belong in that world yet, but she had stepped into it, even if just for one night. She didn't know if she would call the composer or if she even could. But one thing was certain. She would never forget what had happened. That night wasn't just an event or a performance. It was the moment her quiet world opened, the moment her music stopped being a secret. And though the city outside was full of noise, in her heart there was a kind of calm, a silent promise that her story was only beginning. She smiled in the dark, whispering to herself, maybe this was meant to happen. And somewhere deep inside her, the same melody she had played that night kept playing softly, like a heartbeat she would never lose again. The morning sun slipped through the restaurant's tall windows, touching every polished glass and silver spoon with a soft glow. The staff moved quickly, setting tables, checking menus, arranging flowers. But the air felt different that day, tense, expectant, like something big was about to happen. For her, the day felt longer than usual. Every sound, every clatter in the kitchen seemed to echo louder. She tried to keep busy, folding napkins and wiping counters, pretending not to feel the nervous flutter inside her chest. She was trying to act normal, but deep down she knew tonight would be unlike any other. The charity gala had been talked about for weeks. It wasn't just another event, it was the night when some of the most powerful people in the city would gather under the restaurant's glowing chandeliers. Business owners, film producers, philanthropists, and local politicians, all dressed in their best, smiling for cameras and toasting to good causes. The manager had been pacing since morning. "Everything needs to be perfect," he kept saying. "Not good, not okay. Perfect." He stopped every few minutes to double-check something. The wine list, the music equipment, the flower arrangements. The rest of the staff followed orders quickly, not daring to make mistakes. She moved quietly among them, her apron neatly tied, her hair perfectly in place. She didn't speak much. She just did her work, refilling glasses, carrying trays, checking the piano. The same piano that would soon decide how the night went for her. At first, she couldn't believe it was really happening. She had spent the whole week replaying the manager's words in her mind. "You'll play at the gala, just background music." He had said it casually, but to her it meant everything. She hadn't told anyone at home, not even her mother. It felt like a fragile secret, something that might break if spoken too soon. That afternoon, she arrived earlier than usual. She stood near the piano, her fingers brushing over the keys gently, testing the sound. The instrument had been tuned that morning by a professional, and it sounded more beautiful than she had ever heard it before. Each note felt alive, almost like it was waiting for her. "Don't look so nervous," the security guard teased softly as he walked by. "You'll be fine. Just play like you always do." She smiled faintly. "I'm trying," she whispered. As evening came, the restaurant transformed. Lights dimmed. To a golden hue, candles flickered on every table, and the faint scent of roses filled the air. The staff moved in a rhythm they knew by heart, serving with smiles, carrying plates gracefully, clearing quietly. Everything looked perfect, at least on the surface. When the first guests began to arrive, she could feel her pulse in her throat. Elegant cars stopped outside, doors opened, and the city's finest walked in one after another. They were people she had only ever seen in magazines or on TV, dressed in shining gowns and sharp suits, laughing softly as cameras flashed around them. She stayed near the piano, trying to calm herself. Her uniform was still the same plain one she always wore. The manager had offered her a black dress from the storage room, but it didn't fit quite right, so she chose to keep her work clothes. Somehow it made her feel grounded. The piano sat near the center of the dining hall where everyone could see it. That thought made her both excited and terrified. She could hear the guests talking, glasses clinking, laughter rising and falling like waves. For a moment she wondered if she had made a mistake. Then the manager walked past her and whispered, "All right, start in 5 minutes. Just soft music, nothing dramatic. Keep it gentle." She nodded. Her hands were shaking slightly, but she took a deep breath. She waited for the right moment, then slowly sat down on the piano bench. The chatter in the room continued as if no one noticed her. She pressed the first key. The note was soft, clear, and perfect. She played another, and then another, until a gentle melody filled the air. At first, no one paid attention. The guests were too busy talking about business, their voices blending into a pleasant background noise. But as she continued, the sound began to shape the mood of the room. The music flowed smoothly, slow, calming, elegant. It wrapped around the people like a warm breeze, making the atmosphere feel softer, more intimate. She lost herself in the melody. Her fingers moved gracefully, the notes blending like whispers. She forgot where she was. She forgot about the expensive clothes, the flashing cameras, the endless chatter. For a while, there was only the music and her. A woman at one of the front tables turned her head, surprised. She nudged her companion and nodded toward the piano. "Who's playing?" she whispered. Her companion shrugged. "I don't know. She works here, I think." "Really?" the woman said, watching with interest. Slowly, more people began to notice. The sound wasn't just background anymore. It had emotion, depth, something that made them stop mid-conversation. One by one, heads turned toward the piano, eyes drawn to the quiet young woman in a waitress uniform, playing as if the music were part of her soul. The chatter in the room faded. Even the waiters slowed down, careful not to interrupt the moment. The manager, who had been talking to a group of guests near the bar, turned his head and stared. For a second he forgot what he was saying. She didn't notice any of it. She was far away, lost in a memory that only she could hear. The melody she played wasn't written on any sheet. It was something she had composed long ago when she was still a girl dreaming of concert halls and bright lights. It was a song about longing, hope, and quiet courage. When the final note drifted into silence, the room remained still. No one clapped right away. It was as if everyone needed a moment to return from wherever the music had taken them. Then, slowly, applause began to spread through the room. Soft, at first, then stronger until the entire hall echoed with it. She blinked, startled, realizing that everyone was looking at her. Her cheeks flushed with surprise. She didn't know what to do, so she just smiled shyly and gave a small nod before turning back to the piano. From that moment on, the evening changed. People who had come expecting another typical gala now sat with renewed attention. They wanted to hear more. They wanted to know who she was. The manager walked up to her quietly during the break and whispered, "Keep playing. They love it." She nodded, her heart full. For the next hour she played as she had never played before. Each song carried a piece of her story, a dream she had buried, a moment she had lost. The guests didn't know her name, but they could feel her through every note. Some closed their eyes while listening. Others smiled softly, lost in thought. A well-known composer sitting among the guests leaned over to a friend and whispered, "That girl has something rare. She's not just playing the notes, she's speaking through them." By the time dessert was served, her hands were trembling, but she didn't want to stop. The applause after each piece grew louder, warmer. Some guests approached her between songs, thanking her and asking where she had studied music. She simply smiled and said, "I learned a long time ago." When the event finally began to wind down, the restaurant glowed with a kind of peaceful energy. The guests looked happy, their hearts lighter than when they had arrived. The charity had raised more money than expected, but everyone kept talking about the unexpected pianist who had made the night feel magical. After the last song, she stood up slowly. Her knees felt weak, but her smile was genuine. The manager walked over and said quietly, "You made this night unforgettable." She looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for letting me play." Outside, the night was cool and calm. She stepped into the quiet street, the city lights shining softly against the sky. For a long moment, she just stood there, listening to the echoes of her own music still ringing in her ears. She didn't know what would come next. Maybe nothing would change. Maybe tomorrow she would be back to serving tables like always. But something deep inside her had awakened. For the first time in years, she had shared her music with the world, and the world had listened. That night, as she walked home, she smiled to herself. The sound of her footsteps mixed with the faint memory of the piano. She had been afraid to believe in dreams again. But now, she could feel that something new was beginning, something she couldn't yet name. The night that was supposed to be just another shift had turned into a memory that would never leave her heart. It was the start of something she didn't plan, but maybe something she was meant to live all along. And as the city lights flickered in the distance, she whispered softly to herself, "Maybe this is just the beginning." The restaurant lights always felt too bright for her tired eyes. Every evening, as the clock hit 6, she tied her apron, brushed her hair into a neat bun, and stepped onto the shining marble floor of the city's most elegant dining hall. The air carried the soft sound of clinking glasses, polite laughter, and the distant hum of a piano that no one ever really listened to. She worked silently, her movements gentle and graceful, almost invisible among the polished tables and expensive perfume that filled the room. The guests came dressed in designer suits and glittering jewelry, never noticing the girl who refilled their glasses or cleared their plates. She didn't mind it most days. There was comfort in being unseen. But deep inside, she carried something no one there could imagine. When the last guest left and the restaurant emptied out, the world became quiet. The chairs were stacked, the lights dimmed, and only the faint smell of food and wine lingered. That was when she came alive. She would slowly walk toward the old piano that sat in the corner, covered in a soft layer of dust, ignored by everyone except her. She would wipe it clean with a napkin, take a deep breath, and let her fingers touch the keys. And in that moment, the tired waitress became someone else entirely. Her hands moved gently at first, then faster, bringing to life the sounds she carried in her heart all day long. The melodies were not from any famous composer. They were pieces she created in her mind, little stories of hope, pain, and forgotten dreams. She had learned to play when she was a child. Her mother used to save coins for months just to pay for her piano lessons. But life had its own plans. When her father fell sick, the lessons stopped and the piano was sold to pay the bills. She was still young, but old enough to understand what sacrifice meant. After that, she only played when she found an old keyboard at school or at a friend's house. And then, when she grew older, music became a secret part of her, something she carried quietly like a hidden scar. Now, years later, that same girl worked long hours, serving meals to people who never looked twice at her. But every night when she sat by that piano, she remembered who she used to be. She didn't need an audience. The empty room was enough. The sound filled her chest, the notes chasing away the loneliness that life had built around her. Sometimes the security guard passing by would stop and listen. He would lean against the wall, close his eyes, and say, "You play like someone who's telling a story." She would smile shyly and whisper, "Maybe I am." But no one else knew. The other staff had gone home, and the owner never stayed late enough to hear her. Her days followed the same quiet rhythm. Mornings were slow, afternoons busy, and nights long. But through it all, she carried her secret world of music. She had stopped thinking about performing years ago. Dreams like that didn't belong to people like her, or so she believed. Then one afternoon, everything began to change. The restaurant manager called the staff for a quick meeting. "Listen up," he said, adjusting his tie nervously. "We've got a big event coming up this weekend. A charity gala. Important people are coming. Artists, politicians, maybe even a few celebrities. We can't afford any mistakes. Everyone needs to be at their best." The staff nodded. The girl listened quietly from the back, not saying a word. She was used to these fancy events, though she never took part in the excitement. She simply made sure every glass was full, every plate was spotless, and every guest was satisfied. That was her world, steady, simple, unnoticed. But this time something felt different. The manager seemed tense more than usual. The event was a huge deal for the restaurant's reputation. Everything had to be perfect, from the food to the decorations to the live music that would play through the night. Later that evening, while she was polishing silverware in the back, she overheard two of the waiters talking. "Did you hear?" one said. "The pianist just canceled. He got sick and can't make it." "What? For the gala?" the other replied in shock. "That's in 3 days." The girl froze for a second, her hand still holding a fork and knife. The words echoed in her head like an invitation she was too afraid to answer. "The manager's trying to find a replacement," the waiter continued. "But everyone's booked. It's impossible to find someone good on such short notice." She didn't say anything. She just kept polishing, pretending not to listen. But her heart started beating faster. For the rest of the shift, she couldn't stop thinking about it. The empty piano, the grand event, and the chance that maybe, just maybe, she could help. That night, after everyone left, she sat at the piano again. Her fingers trembled slightly as she played. The notes were soft at first, then stronger, as if she were having a silent conversation with herself. She imagined the room filled with people, their eyes on her. The thought scared her and thrilled her all at once. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "No, that's crazy. They'd never let me." But deep down, something inside her refused to let go of the thought. The next day, during the afternoon break, she gathered all her courage and walked up to the manager's office. He was sitting behind his desk, talking on the phone, his expression tired and frustrated. When he finally hung up, she hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Sir," she said softly, "I heard about the pianist." He looked up. Yeah, a disaster. Do you know anyone who can play? She hesitated, then said, almost whispering, I can play. The manager blinked, confused. You? Yes, she said, her voice quiet but steady. I've played piano since I was a child. I could fill in if you'd let me. He stared at her for a moment, trying to read her face. Then he laughed lightly, not unkindly, but as if the idea was impossible. You're a waitress. This is an event for the city's elite. We can't risk something like that. Her cheeks grew warm. I understand, she said quickly, backing away. I just thought, maybe I could help. Look, he said, softening his tone. I appreciate the offer, really, but we'll find someone. Don't worry about it. She nodded and left quietly, but the sting of his laughter stayed with her all day. That night, she didn't go home right away. She sat at the piano again, her emotions pouring into the keys. Her music that night was different, stronger, more alive. The security guard came by again and said, You sound like you're fighting with your heart. She smiled sadly. Maybe I am. The next evening, she found out that the manager was still struggling to find a pianist. The event was only 2 days away now, and every professional musician he contacted was already booked. He looked more stressed than ever, pacing back and forth in the staff area. Without thinking too much, she spoke again. Sir, she said gently, if no one's available, please, let me try, just once. If I'm not good, you can find someone else. This time, the manager didn't laugh. He just stared at her for a moment, his expression uncertain. Then he sighed. Fine, we'll try it tomorrow after closing. If you can play something decent, maybe I'll consider it. But no promises, her heart jumped. She nodded quickly, thanking him before she could change her mind. That night, she barely slept. Her hands ached from work, but her mind was full of melodies. She thought about her mother, who used to listen with a smile every time she played as a child. She thought about how life had pushed her dreams so far away, and how this small chance might bring them back, even just for one night. The next evening, after the restaurant closed, the manager stayed behind with a few staff members. She sat at the piano, her heart racing. The lights felt too bright, and the silence in the room pressed on her like a heavy blanket. The manager crossed his arms. All right, he said. Let's hear it. She took a deep breath and placed her hands on the keys. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she began to play. The first few notes were soft and uncertain, but as the melody grew, her nerves started to fade. The music poured out of her like a confession, gentle, beautiful, and full of emotion. Her fingers moved gracefully, telling stories without words. When she finished, the room stayed silent for a moment. Then the manager exhaled slowly. You weren't kidding, he said quietly. That was incredible. She looked down, trying not to smile too wide. He nodded. All right. You'll play at the gala. Just background music, nothing too fancy. But it'll do. Her heart leapt. Thank you, sir, she said softly. As she walked home that night, the city lights shimmered around her. For the first time in a long while, she felt like her life was about to change. She didn't know how the night of the event would go, but deep inside, she knew one thing. She was finally being given a chance to let the world hear her voice. And she was ready.